Human nature dictates a very simple, very dangerous psychological rule. Tell someone they cannot do something, and it becomes the only thing they want to do. Tell the public that a location is closed, and it immediately becomes a magnet for conspiracy theorists, urban explorers, and thrill seekers. We are a species obsessed with uncovering secrets. We have mapped the ocean floor, we have charted the stars, and we have built sprawling metropolises over once impenetrable jungles. But there are still places on this planet that reject our presence. Places where the warning signs are not put up by superstitious locals or angry property owners, but by the global scientific community. These are locations where crossing the perimeter does not just mean breaking the law. It means exposing your biology to irreversible destruction. The scientists who study these areas do not wear security uniforms. They wear hazmat suits, radiation dosimeters, and positive pressure biological containment gear. They have drawn red lines across maps and declared that these environments are fundamentally incompatible with human life. Today, we are going to explore 8 of the most strictly forbidden places on Earth that scientists desperately want you to avoid. From subterranean infernos burning beneath the United States to isolated islands contaminated by military weaponized pathogens, these are the regions where the Earth has become toxic and where human curiosity is a guaranteed death sentence. Our first forbidden destination is located dangerously close to one of the most populated regions in the United States. Just off the eastern tip of Long Island, New York, sits Plum Island. For decades, this 3-mile-long strip of land has been the epicenter of intense American conspiracy theories, and for good reason. From 1954 until very recently, Plum Island was home to the highly secretive Plum Island Animal Disease Center, a federal research facility tasked with studying the most contagious and devastating agricultural pathogens on the planet. Officially, the scientists on Plum Island were working to protect the American food supply, studying foreign diseases like foot and mouth disease or African swine fever. They operated under strict biosafety level 3 agricultural protocols. But the heavy military presence, the absolute refusal to allow public access, and the island's shadowy Cold War history birthed a much darker narrative. The facility was established during an era when the United States military was actively exploring biological warfare. Documents later revealed that former Nazi scientist Erich Traub, a biological weapons expert brought to the U.S. under Operation Paperclip, was heavily involved in the early planning of the facility's operations. This connection fueled rampant speculation that Plum Island was not just defensive but offensive. The most famous, enduring theory suggests that Lyme disease, which suddenly appeared in the town of Lyme, Connecticut, just a few miles across the water from the facility in the 1970s, was actually a weaponized tick experiment that escaped the island's containment protocols. While the government vigorously denies this, the scientific reality of Plum Island is terrifying enough without the conspiracies. The island's laboratories held active cultures of viruses that, if released, could instantly decimate the North American agricultural economy, causing global starvation and immediate economic collapse. Even as the facility transitions its operations to a new lab in Kansas, the soil and the legacy of Plum Island remain heavily restricted. Scientists know exactly what was bred in those concrete walls, and they have no intention of letting the public anywhere near it. From the biological secrets of New York, we move across the Atlantic to a place where the terror is not microscopic, but aggressively radioactive. Deep within the exclusion zone of northern Ukraine, inside the ruined basement of the infamous Chernobyl nuclear power plant, lies an object so scientifically horrifying that just looking at it in the same room for a few minutes will kill you. It is known as the elephant's foot. In April 1986, when reactor number 4 exploded, the uranium fuel rods, the graphite control rods, and the concrete of the reactor core melted together in a catastrophic nuclear fire. This molten mass of highly radioactive material, resembling artificial lava, burned through the steel and concrete floors of the reactor building and flowed into the dark basement corridors before finally cooling and hardening into a massive, wrinkled shape resembling an elephant's foot. This substance is called corium, and it is arguably the most toxic, dangerous material ever created by mankind. When the elephant's foot was first discovered by cleanup crews in the autumn of 1986, it was emitting over 10,000 Röntgens of radiation per hour. To put that into perspective, receiving a dose of 500 Röntgens over 5 hours is usually fatal. The elephant's foot could deliver a lethal dose to a human being in less than 300 seconds. If you stood next to it, the intense gamma radiation would physically tear apart your cellular structure, destroying your DNA and causing catastrophic acute radiation sickness. Your central nervous system would collapse and your organs would shut down. Even today, decades later, the elephant's foot remains fiercely radioactive. The scientists who occasionally monitor it must use remote-controlled robots, and the few photographs of it were taken using mirrors from around corners to avoid direct exposure. The radiation is so intense that it actually interferes with camera film, causing static-like distortions on the images. The elephant's foot is a monument to human arrogance, a glowing, silent killer locked in a crumbling basement, and a place where science strictly dictates that biology has no chance of survival. Our third forbidden location takes us to a sun-baked landscape in East Africa, where the water itself turns living creatures into stone. Located in northern Tanzania, near the border of Kenya, is Lake Natron. At first glance, the lake looks like a breathtaking alien landscape, with swirling pools of deep crimson and cracked white salt crusts. But this vibrant color is a warning sign. Lake Natron is one of the most extreme aquatic environments on Earth. The lake is fed by mineral-rich hot springs and a nearby active volcano, which pumps massive amounts of sodium carbonate and other alkaline minerals into the water. Because the lake has no outlet, the water can only escape through evaporation in the brutal African heat, leaving behind highly concentrated alkaline salts. As a result, the pH level of Lake Natron can spike up to 10.5, which is almost as alkaline as straight ammonia. The water temperature can also reach a blistering 140 degrees Fahrenheit, or 60 degrees Celsius. For almost every species on the planet, diving into this lake is a fatal mistake. If a bird or a bat crashes into the water, the extreme alkalinity immediately begins to strip away their skin and burn their eyes. When they die, the high concentration of sodium carbonate, the exact same chemical the ancient Egyptians used in the mummification process, rapidly calcifies their bodies. As the water recedes during the dry season, perfectly preserved, stone-like statues of birds and bats are left scattered along the shoreline. They look as though they have been frozen in time by dark magic. Scientists study Lake Natron because it provides a rare glimpse into extremophile biology. Amazingly, a specific species of cyanobacteria thrives in this toxic soup, giving the lake its red color. Furthermore, lesser flamingos actually use the toxic, shallow waters to breed, because the caustic environment perfectly protects their nests from mammalian predators who dare not cross the burning salt flats. But for humans, the scientific consensus is clear. Do not touch the water. A simple splash in Lake Natron will cause severe chemical burns to human skin, making it a beautiful but strictly forbidden natural trap. Our fourth location brings us back to the United States, to a disaster zone that looks and feels exactly like a real-life horror movie. In fact, it served as the direct inspiration for the terrifying video game and film franchise, Silent Hill. This is the town of Centralia, Pennsylvania. In the 1950s, Centralia was a bustling, prosperous coal mining town. But in 1962, a seemingly mundane mistake triggered an apocalyptic chain reaction. The local government decided to burn trash in an abandoned strip mine pit to clean up the town. Unfortunately, the fire ignited an exposed vein of anthracite coal deep underground. Once the coal caught fire, it began to spread through the massive, interconnected labyrinth of abandoned mining tunnels beneath the town. And it never stopped. Today, the fire beneath Centralia has been burning continuously for over 60 years. And scientists estimate there is enough coal down there to keep it burning for another 250 years. The surface of the town is a nightmare. Deep fissures rip through the empty asphalt highways, violently belching plumes of highly toxic, sulfurous smoke into the air. The ground is unnervingly warm to the touch, and in some places, the soil temperature reaches several hundred degrees. Centralia was largely abandoned in the 1980s after a terrifying incident where the ground suddenly opened up beneath a 12-year-old boy named Todd Domboski. He fell into a sinkhole that was pumping out lethal levels of carbon monoxide and was only saved because he managed to grab an exposed tree root. Following this near-fatal event, the United States government condemned the entire town, revoked its zip code, and bought out the residents. Scientists and geologists heavily advise against visiting Centralia. The danger is not just the deadly carbon monoxide gas that can quietly suffocate you if the wind shifts. The real terror is the structural integrity of the ground beneath your feet. The subterranean fire has burned away millions of tons of coal, leaving massive, hollow, unsupported caverns just beneath the surface. The ground can collapse at any absolute moment, swallowing a visitor into a superheated, toxic furnace with zero warning. It is a town legally and scientifically erased from the map. The fifth location on our list was erased for a completely different reason. It was locked down to protect the absolute purity of scientific observation. Rising violently from the freezing waters of the North Atlantic Ocean, about 20 miles off the southern coast of Iceland, is Surtsey Island. Surtsey did not exist before 1963. It was violently birthed over the course of 3 years by a massive underwater volcanic eruption. When the ash and lava finally settled, a brand new, completely sterile landmass had formed. For the global scientific community, this was a miraculous event. It offered a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to observe the exact biological process of primary succession, how life colonizes a completely barren, lifeless piece of rock from absolute scratch. To protect this incredibly fragile experiment, the Icelandic government immediately declared Surtsey a heavily restricted nature reserve. Absolutely no one is allowed to set foot on the island except for a highly select, tiny group of scientists. And even their visits are heavily regulated. Before stepping onto the island, researchers are thoroughly searched to ensure they are not carrying any foreign seeds, soil, or unauthorized biological material on their clothes or boots. The goal is to see how seeds are brought naturally by ocean currents, wind, or the digestive tracts of passing birds. The strictness of this quarantine was hilariously, but seriously, proven a few decades ago, when an unauthorized tomato plant was suddenly discovered growing in the volcanic ash. The scientists were baffled until they realized that one of their own researchers had improperly disposed of human waste after eating a tomato. The plant was immediately ripped out and destroyed to preserve the integrity of the natural colonization process. Surtsey is an island strictly forbidden to humanity, not because it will kill us, but because our mere footprint, a single seed stuck to our shoe, or a stray crumb from our lunch, would irreversibly contaminate the purest biological experiment on the planet. Our sixth destination is an island with a history so dark and scientifically malevolent that it was deemed completely uninhabitable for half a century. Off the northwestern coast of Scotland lies Gruinard Island. Today, it looks like a peaceful, picturesque Scottish isle, but during the height of the Second World War, it was the site of a terrifying biological nightmare known as Operation Vegetarian. In 1942, the British military was desperately searching for a weapon that could cripple the Nazi war machine. They decided to weaponize anthrax, a highly lethal bacterial spore that causes catastrophic internal hemorrhaging and death. The plan was incredibly sinister. They intended to drop millions of linseed cakes infected with anthrax over the German countryside, targeting the cattle population to cause mass starvation and a nationwide lethal epidemic. But before they could deploy this apocalyptic weapon, they needed a place to test it. They chose Gruinard Island. The military brought a flock of sheep to the island and detonated bombs packed with the highly virulent Volum 14578 strain of anthrax. The results were immediate and horrifying. The sheep began dying in agony within days. The test proved the weapon worked perfectly, but it also revealed a terrifying scientific truth. Anthrax spores are incredibly resilient. They do not just vanish. They embed themselves into the soil, where they can remain highly infectious and lethal for decades, if not centuries. After the war, the British government realized they had created an unstoppable biological hazard. Gruinard Island was entirely cordoned off. Warning signs were erected, explicitly stating that landing on the island was prohibited and that the soil itself was deadly. For nearly 50 years, the island remained a silent, deadly monument to biological warfare. It wasn't until the late 1980s that scientists attempted a massive decontamination effort, soaking the entire island in hundreds of tons of formaldehyde and seawater. In 1990, the government officially declared the island safe, but the psychological and scientific stigma remains. Many experts and locals still vehemently advise against ever setting foot on Gruinard, knowing the unpredictable, terrifying longevity of weaponized bacterial spores. The seventh forbidden place takes us beneath the romantic streets of one of the most visited cities in the world. Paris is famous for its art, its architecture, and its culture. But beneath the cafes and the Louvre exists a massive, sprawling empire of the dead, the Paris Catacombs. While a small, carefully managed 1-mile section is open to tourists, the vast, overwhelming majority of the catacombs, an estimated 150 to 200 miles of winding, dark tunnels, is strictly illegal and highly dangerous to enter. These unmapped quarries were dug centuries ago to mine limestone for the city's buildings. In the late 18th century, when the cemeteries of Paris began overflowing and causing massive public health crises, the bones of over 6 million Parisians were relocated into these dark subterranean depths. Scientists, urban planners, and the specialized French police force known as the Catafliques violently discourage urban explorers from breaking into the forbidden zones. The dangers are not supernatural. They are brutally physical and environmental. First, the structural integrity of these ancient tunnels is constantly degrading. Massive cave-ins are a regular occurrence, threatening to crush anyone caught below or trap them under millions of tons of rock, with absolutely no cell phone signal to call for help. Secondly, the environmental conditions are deadly. In certain deep sections of the catacombs, poor ventilation leads to pockets of toxic gas and severe oxygen depletion. An explorer can walk into a blind tunnel, suddenly feel lightheaded, pass out from lack of oxygen, and never wake up. The sheer complexity of the labyrinth is a psychological terror in itself. If your flashlight battery dies, or if you take 2 wrong turns in a maze of identical bone-lined corridors, you will be consumed by absolute, pitch-black darkness. People have wandered into the forbidden zones and vanished without a trace, their remains eventually blending in with the millions of skeletons already resting there. It is a place where geology and history conspire to create a perfect, inescapable trap. Our eighth and final forbidden location is a place steeped in dark psychological horror and lethal epidemiology. Situated in the Venetian lagoon in northern Italy is the island of Poveglia. For centuries, this tiny island has served as the ultimate dumping ground for the diseased, the dying, and the unwanted. During the horrific outbreaks of the bubonic plague or the Black Death that swept through Europe in the 14th and 16th centuries, Venice enacted brutal quarantine laws. Anyone showing even the slightest symptom of the plague was forcibly dragged from their home and exiled to Poveglia. It was not a hospital, it was a death camp. Thousands of infected citizens were left there to die in agony. When the death toll became too massive to handle, the bodies were thrown into massive fire pits and burned. Scientists and historians estimate that over 100,000 people died on this tiny piece of land. The devastation was so absolute that today, soil analysis reveals that nearly 50% of the topsoil on Poveglia is composed of human ash and calcified bone dust. If the plague history wasn't dark enough, the island was later repurposed in 1922 as a psychiatric asylum. According to well-documented historical records and enduring local legends, a sadistic doctor ran the facility, performing brutal, experimental lobotomies on the patients without anesthesia. The doctor eventually went mad himself, allegedly driven insane by the screams of the plague victims, and threw himself from the island's bell tower. Today, Poveglia is entirely abandoned and strictly off-limits to the public. The Italian government has sealed the island, and the local water police constantly patrol its perimeter. While ghost hunters are obsessed with the island's dark energy, scientists have much more grounded reasons for keeping people away. The decaying infrastructure of the asylum is incredibly dangerous, prone to sudden collapses. Furthermore, the massive concentration of ancient human remains and ash presents unpredictable biological and environmental hazards. Poveglia is an island completely saturated in death, a place where the horrific echoes of human suffering have literally become the foundation of the earth. 8 locations, 8 terrifying boundaries drawn by science and history. From the weaponized ticks of Plum Island and the nuclear lava of Chernobyl, to the petrifying waters of Lake Natron and the burning underground maze of Centralia. We have seen islands quarantined to protect us from anthrax and the plague, an island locked down to protect nature from us, and a subterranean labyrinth of bones that promises to swallow anyone foolish enough to wander into the dark. The scientists who study these places are not trying to ruin our fun or hide secret treasures. They are performing the ultimate act of preservation and protection. They study the extremes of biology, chemistry, and physics so that we don't have to experience them firsthand. The locked doors and the warning signs are not challenges to be overcome. They are literal lifelines. The human desire to explore is the very trait that built our civilization. But absolute survival requires an equally important trait: the wisdom to know when to turn back. Some places on this earth do not want to be conquered. They are hostile, they are unforgiving, and they are deadly. And the smartest thing we can possibly do is listen to the scientists, respect the boundaries, and leave these forbidden places exactly as they are. Which of these scientifically terrifying locations gave you the deepest chills? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the dark side of our planet, hit that subscribe button, because the Earth is full of incredible secrets, and we have barely scratched the surface. Stay curious, stay safe, and I will see you in the next one.